Continuing example 2C, requirement 7. Go back to the original data. Calculate Beckett's degree of operating leverage at its current level of sales. Degree of operating leverage is a measure of riskiness or sensitivity of changes in net operating income to changes in sales revenue. So essentially what it says is, how sensitive is my profitability to changes in revenue? Am I in a situation where small changes in revenue will lead to relatively small changes in net income, or where small changes in revenue will lead to relatively high changes in net operating income? The calculation is kind of simple, but the way it works is a little bit subtle. So we'll go ahead and work on this. The calculation for degree of operating leverage is to take the contribution margin and divide it by the net operating income. So using our original data, with 8,500 units per year being sold, we have a contribution margin of $1,020,000, and we have net operating income of $120,000. And so our DOL, our degree of operating leverage, is just going to be the division between those two, or 8.5. And this is something where the unit of measure is a little bit unclear or awkward, but we could say there's 8.5 times, or we could even say there's 8.5 degrees of operating leverage. This is the one number in the course that I don't have a great unit of measure on. So what this tells us is that contribution margin is 8.5 times net operating income. Well, what does that really mean? Well, really what it tells us is that if we have a particular change in revenue, a percentage change in revenue, we can take that percentage change of revenue, multiply it by our degree of operating leverage, and that'll tell us the percentage change in net operating income. So let's demonstrate how that works. So let's say, for example, what happens if we have a 10% change in revenue? So revenue goes up by 10%. And what we don't mean here is that our selling price per unit goes up, but the number of units sold goes up by 10%. What we should be able to do is take our percent change in revenue, multiply it by our degree of operating leverage, and predict our percent change in net operating income. So what this tells us is with a 10% change in revenue, we will have an 85% change in net operating income. That sounds a little extreme. It sounds higher than would make sense. But let's go ahead and confirm whether this is true or not. So let's see what happens. A 10% change in revenue, which would be a 10% increase in the number of units sold. We're going to take our 8,500 units times 1.1, and we get 9,350. 10% of 8,500 would be 850. You add 850 to the 8,500, so the 10% change means our total units sold is 9,350. If we adjust our units upward from 8,500 to 9,350, revenue goes up to 1.87 million. And again, we can see the difference here. 10% of 1.7 million is 170,000. Add that to the 1.7 million, you get 1.87 million. Contribution goes up to 1.122. Fixed costs stay the same because they're fixed, and net operating income is $222,000. So our new NOI is 222. Our old NOI before the change is 120. So our change in NOI is the difference here, or 102. Now, what percent of our old NOI does this represent? So we can take our 102,000 divided by the 120,000, and it is an 85% change in our net operating income. Now, is this good or is it bad? Well, if sales go up 10%, it's really nice to have an 85% increase in net operating income. But what if sales, instead of going up by 10%, went down by 10%? So instead of selling 110% of the units we used to, we're only selling 90% of the units we used to. Well, let's see what happens. Sales go down from 8,500 units to 7,650 units. Revenue drops from 1.7 million to 1.53 million. Contribution drops from 1.02 million to 918,000. So our new net income is only $18,000. Again, fixed costs stay the same with this change because they're fixed. So our new income is 18,000. Our old net income was our 120, and so our change is a decrease of $102,000, which is in fact an 85% decrease. So this shows how leverage is, in a sense, a two-edged sword. A high degree of operating leverage, the higher your degree of operating leverage, the more net income will go up as sales go up. But at the same time, the more income will go down as sales go down. If our degree of operating leverage was lower, then a 10% change in revenue would have a smaller increase in net operating income because our variable costs would continue to increase quite a bit more. But it would also have a smaller decrease on the way back down. So whether we want a high or a low degree of operating leverage depends on our optimism about the future. If we're very optimistic, if we have very good confidence that sales are going to continue to increase, then we would like most of our costs to be fixed so they won't increase as revenue increases, and that'll help net income go up faster. If we're unsure, or if we're actually pessimistic about the future, we'd like more of our costs to be variable, which would reduce our degree of operating leverage, and then as sales go down, costs would go down with it, and income would be somewhat protected. So that's degree of operating leverage. The particular formula, as I said, is contribution margin divided by net operating income. And it's a little bit obscure how it works, but the fact is it does tell you something useful about how risky or how much upside you have based on how much your costs are fixed versus variable. So that's requirement 7, degree of operating leverage.